Before this topic, regarding the last topic, I'd just like to mention two items that have been helpful with regard to controversial issues. One is a list of suggested interview questions regarding Catholic identity for teacher applicants, and even you can even adjust it for principal applicants. The Norbertines came up with it in Orange County. They have a rector at one of our parish high schools in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and it's excellent. When I got a hold of it, I massaged it a little bit, gave it to our general counsel's office. They were fine with it, ran it through the principal's meeting, the president's meeting. They were all on board with it, and many people use it. I forgot to bring copies, but if you go to just Google Archdiocese of Los Angeles Administrative Handbook, and then it has a great search engine, and just put in suggested interview questions. It'll pop up. And it looks like they've added to it since I left. Religious ed people got a hold of it, so be careful. But it looks like it's still most of the original questions. The second thing, and it's not online, and I could send it to Father Stravinskas. About 2 years ago, associate pastor came back from visiting confirmation classes. And he said, you know, there's a few girls that are pro-choice and are adamant about it, and they shouldn't be receiving confirmation because we're just creating more Pelosi's. And I said, okay, let me work on that one. And I went back to years ago, Bishop Basha in Santa Rosa Diocese came up with an affirmation of faith for teachers. And it made a lot of controversy, and he had to roll it back a little bit and do a lot of teacher instruction. But in general, it's a very good document. So I found it, it was still online. I took it and I rearranged the order, put all the sexual stuff last instead of first, and put the Eucharist liturgy first, and then changed some of the wording. We ran it through Google Translate, put it in Spanish, and then had somebody check it to make sure it was okay. And it's a pretty good document, and we use it as a teaching document. All the confirmation kids have to sign it upon enrollment. Their sponsors have to sign it if they're going to be a sponsor. We give it to all of our teachers in our school. And it's, besides being a great teaching instrument, it is also, it states our expectation up front. So, and I could send that to Father Stravinskas when I get back home. Now, marketing, recruitment, retention. Father Davis gave one of the best presentations I've ever heard. So I could just sit down and we could take questions. I mean, he had so much, and I want to get copies of that, hopefully in larger print, and give it to a lot of people back at home. I'll just give a little bit about my experience in the Wild West of Los Angeles. In the Archdiocese, when I was a principal and became a superintendent, we had 51 high schools. And of the 51 high schools, 21 of them were archdiocesan high schools, 5 were parish high schools, and 25 were private high schools. And the private high schools and the archdiocesan high schools, we had a good relationship. Most of the principals still went to principals meetings, and in some dioceses that doesn't happen. But we had a good working relationship. And in the 12 years that I was a high school principal, 96 to 08, it was a suburban school that had inner city kids predominantly. Strange situation, suburban neighborhood, but almost 100% inner city kids from South Central, Compton, and Watts. And in those 12 years, I never was counseled once about improving Catholic identity or increasing enrollment. And in all those 12 years of principals meetings, and we would have about 3 to 4 principals meetings a year at the diocesan level, and then 3 at the regional level. Never once in 12 years did I hear anything about marketing, recruitment, retention, or Catholic identity. But I knew that since I inherited a school that was struggling with numbers and Catholic identity, most of the kids were not Catholic, and the enrollment when I got there was 380 students, and we were building a cathedral. We call it a cathedral at least, and we LA Unified which is where our school is found in the region, or in that, the boundaries of that district, LA Unified was building schools and they were looking for property. And I thought to myself, without asking anybody, I just thought to myself, you know, this school is declining. What a great thing to be for the Archdiocese to be able to sell it to LA Unified, make a bunch of money for that wonderful cathedral. So it motivated me to work hard to increase the numbers and to increase its Catholic identity at the same time, because if it wasn't going to be authentically Catholic, why would I even be there? And that motivation caused the enrollment to grow with efforts of working with the administrative team, et cetera. And we went from, in 12 years, 380 students to 650 students. We went from 70% non-Catholic to, after 12 years, 50-50. But the Catholic identity was stronger than some of the neighboring schools that were 80% Catholic. We had Protestant ministers who had their kids in our school. We even had the secretary to the Lutheran Bishop of Los Angeles who had her kids in school, and would go to the Adoration Chapel every day to make a visit. Very interesting. When I was getting antsy, about year 11, year 12, I thought, maybe it's time to become a pastor. And the fateful day came where Cardinal Mahoney called me in and asked me to be superintendent of the high schools the following year. And I took it as a sign, since Cardinal and I disagreed on so many things before, at least theologically, I thought God must want me to do this if he's asking me. And I found him to be tremendously supportive during the time that I was superintendent and his closing years as an archbishop. And he gave me two things to do. He said, I want you to increase Catholic identity among the high schools the way you did it at your school. And I want you to increase enrollment the way you did it at your school. Those are his two goals. He made it very clear. Said, okay, got the marching orders from the boss. And the first thing we did was, and Father Davis has talked about it, analyze the data, because nobody was doing that. We had a lot of data, and I had no access to it till I went downtown. And we analyzed the data and saw the tremendous decline across the board in our elementary schools as well as our high schools. I think I mentioned a superintendent of high schools. We still had in those days superintendent of elementary, 218 elementaries, and superintendent of high schools. We were completely separate staffs and separate superintendents at the time. And so analyze the data and realized that we had to stop the decline. Some schools had cut their enrollment in half within the course of just 5 years. It's pretty dramatic. And it matched some of the national trends. When you look at the NCA stat book that comes out at the beginning of the school year, pretty grim. By the time I left the job, the national statistics showed the total enrollment for Catholic schools in the United States had dropped to the level of the 1920s. And I'm sure it hasn't gone up much since then. So analyzed it, developed a program which we called Max LA. And part of the program involved requiring that every Catholic high school have a marketing director. We gave them choices as to what they could call this position, missions director, marketing director, but the focus was to be on marketing. If you had a recruitment person, or if you had an admissions director, you could fold it all into this one position, created a job description. If you go to that administrative handbook, there are a lot of good job descriptions that I was able to put together from different sources. Job descriptions for the presidents, the principals without presidents, the principals with presidents, campus ministers, and I think religion chairs. There's a whole bunch of job descriptions in that handbook that are all online and easy to access. But we had a job description for the marketing director, and the reason why I felt the job description was so important was because the evaluation instrument for the principals, campus ministers, et cetera, marketing directors, was completely based on and aligned to the job description. Because if you don't give them the expectation of what they need to do, how can you evaluate on something that's just in your head and not down on paper. So very very clear job descriptions. We gave them, the marketing directors, enrollment benchmarks. And the way we did that was very sneaky on my part. Before the principals knew what I was up to, we did a facilities survey. How many classrooms you have in use? How many classrooms have been converted to other uses? And then list what they were. You know, one became a resource lab, and one became a computer lab or whatever. And we were able to figure out how many actual classrooms were on each campus. We multiplied it by 25 and said, okay, that's going to be your goal for your enrollment. And then the benchmark was to try to increase enrollment by 20 to 25 per year at the high school level. And it was written into the evaluation of the principal as well as the marketing director. How close should you get to that goal? And the principals did not like this at all. They hated it, and it made a lot of enemies of former friends. But there were some principals who loved the challenge and were up to the challenge, and they were able to turn around schools with declining enrollment. The ones that had a hard time getting with the program, I had to, put in the evaluation, give them about 2 or 3 years, and if they didn't get with the program, I had to remove them. And in the course of those 9 years as superintendent of high schools, I think I replaced 17 of the principals. And finding principals, at least in the West, is not the easiest thing to do anymore. And finding teachers out there, I'm not sure what it's like the rest of the country, but it's become very difficult because of the changing situation that we're in as a world, as a community. Young people coming out of colleges are very different than they were 20 years ago. They don't seem to want to stick around long in any place. They want to move on to different things. They're ready for a promotion as soon as they arrive. So yes. I don't know if you've experienced that. We created a database that the schools could have access to. One of the clever things that our marketing team came up with for the diocese was some type of instrument where the marketing directors, as well as the development directors, had to record on a daily basis online the calls they made, the visits they made, the contacts they made. And it was an instrument for them as well as for their principal or their president, depending on who was supervising them. Of course, they didn't like that because they knew that the principal or the president could look at it at any moment and see what they were doing that day. And some principals didn't want to be bothered because it was something new. It was one more thing they had to do. But it really helped in the accountability department with regard to marketing directors and eventually the development directors. With regard to benchmarks for the development directors, eventually we came up with a very simple, how do you come up with numbers for benchmarks for raising money? We were very arbitrary about it, and then we had to see what would happen. And we said that your first year, you're going to increase total development money by 5%. Then the second year, 10%. The third year, 15%. We just went up 5% a year. And some schools, they'd never been given a challenge like that. They rose to the occasion, and other schools surpassed it, and other schools went kicking and fighting. With regard to the marketing program, we had training for the principals with regard to the whole area of marketing and the presidents, if they had presidents. And we also had monthly meetings for the marketing directors, coaching meetings, meetings where they could share what was happening at their school, what new things they were trying, and they could get feedback from their peers from the other schools. Of course, if there were schools near each other that were competition, they were a little more cautious about what they shared, but they were also able to hear from schools, other parts of the diocese that they weren't competing with, which was helpful for them. We came up with an exit survey with regard to retention because kids were leaving some of these schools. We started to follow the retention. And we could see that kids were leaving some schools more than other schools. That was the biggest issue. We had raised the number of new students across the board, but the numbers weren't going up across the board because in some schools, the retention was really bad. So we came up with a retention form where they had to have an exit interview, the family leaving. And we came up with about 8 to 10 different reasons why they would be leaving, and it was kind of like a checkoff thing, so we made it as easy as possible. And it also gave us something that we could chart. For example, were they leaving for religious reasons, for disciplinary reasons, for academic reasons, for athletic reasons? Sometimes that's the issue. And we were able to chart that. And that was an eye-opener for principals because they didn't know retention was the issue across the board, or at least in their particular school, because in our Archdiocesan schools, most of them at that time, and still today, do not have presidents. And if you're a principal, you're doing the job of a president if you have a board, if you have a development director. And if you don't have a board or development director, there's problems there too. So giving this type of information, making it available to the principals, they found to be, for the most part, very, very helpful. With regard to development, we provided specialized training. We were able to get grants to train the principals as well as the development directors. One of the things that came across in most of those training sessions from professional development people was too many schools spend too much time using the gala as a way to raise money. They spend so much in the way of resources and office hours on planning a gala when they should be spending more time on what they call friend raising and contact with alumni, contact with foundations, contact through the grant writing process as well. So the de-emphasis was on having these big events that require so many man hours or people hours, as we say in California. So then I'll just wrap this up with regard to being in an elementary school. Right? I've been a pastor now 6 years. We have a preschool run by sisters. They've been there since the late 50s. They have a sister in every classroom. And we have our K through 8 across the street. And so it's new territory for me these last 6 years because I was in schoolwork for 21 years, high school work. But one of the things that's much more difficult in an elementary school compared to high school is it's a lot harder to add staff. And it's a lot harder to add staff, new positions like a marketing director or a development director, because you have a bigger budget at the high school level. And one of the biggest problems any school, high school or elementary, can have is being overstaffed. Because if you're overstaffed, that's where you can't make payroll. That's where the red flags go up with the diocese, especially if you need to help with meeting a payroll. The schools that had problems at the elementary level, at the high school level, were schools that couldn't meet payroll. You only can't meet payroll if you're overstaffed. So adding the position of a marketing director or development director at an elementary school, a small elementary school, is probably almost impossible. If it's a big elementary school, 500, 600, 700 kids, then it's more possible. But what do you do? How do you do all these things without somebody being paid to do these things? Well, parents, most people don't like committees, but we discovered that by creating a marketing committee with parents and the school principal and the pastor and a diocesan person who happens to be a parent and a parishioner, they got all excited about it. They got all revved up about it, and they became our free marketers. We didn't have to pay them, and it began to change the culture of the parish school with regard to marketing and recruitment. And if you're in a high school and you're not an administrator, maybe you're the chaplain, or maybe you're campus minister, and you have some access to administration, and you don't have something like a marketing director, And again, when I was a principal, we didn't have a marketing director. But what I did was we bring the administrative team together. What did we meet? We met at least twice a month, I think. And we made sure there was time to brainstorm these things. And I made sure that the other administrators became a part of the marketing process. When we did recruitment, we fanned out to 40 schools, 40 elementary schools. We took turns doing different schools, and some of the schools we brought on campus, other schools we went and visited, and some schools got both. And the administrators took ownership of this, the team members. And if they didn't, they were no longer administrator. So I think it'd be helpful though, because some of you aren't administrators and some of you are pastors with elementary schools versus high school work. It'd be good to ask questions for Father and I that might make the advice more specific. Time for questions. And we have 5 minutes.
Yeah.